Hello and welcome to the Reformation Red Pill podcast. I am your host, Joshua Haymes, and today we have as usual, we have an incredibly special episode today. And if you followed me for really any length of time, you've heard me talk a lot about the idea that we ought to be self-consciously striving to make America Christian again. If we're going to MAGA, we must first MACA. And the only way that we can even hope to make America great again is to begin to apply the word of God to the world around us, to all, as Pastor Douglas Wilson is fond of saying, all of Christ for all of life. And that includes politics, that includes government, that includes the public square. We must be Christians on purpose, even in the halls of power. But as that is with really anything related to Christianity and politics, there is a lot of consternation about the idea that we should be, explicitly pursuing a Christian government. What would a truly Christian government look like? How much power would civil magistrates have? What theological, epistemological framework would serve as the basis for our laws? Natural law or theonomy? Of course, there's other options out there. I just happen to think those two are the best. Or is it some combination of the two? And so today we have the distinct privilege of having just a fiery debate between just bitter rivals. We're going to have the theonomy versus natural law debate. So I'm going to bring my illustrious guests up on the screen, and I'll have you guys introduce yourself. First and foremost, Pastor Wilson, if you can just give my audience, who are you, what do you do, and how can people find you?
Okay, my name is Douglas Wilson. I'm the pastor of Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho. Moscow is up in the panhandle of Idaho, up in the north. And I'm a pastor and a writer, and that covers it. And where you can find pretty much everything I'm involved with is if you go to my blog, which is at dougwills.com, blog and Mablog. Pretty much everything I'm involved with, New St. Andrews, Logos School, ACCS, Canon Press, is somewhere on the front page there. So it's a portal to find out what I'm involved with.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, Pastor Wilson. And as for you, Dr. Rigney, if you can answer that same question, who are you, what do you do, and how can people find you?
Sure. I'm Dr. Joe Rigney, and I am around the corner from where Doug is right now.
Excellent. Hey, way to keep it concise so we can get to the meat of. I know you guys are just
25 feet that way.
Hey, Doug.
Hey.
That's good. That's how you know this is going to be.
I teach. I'm a fellow of theology at New St. Andrews, also a pastor here at Christ Church.
That's great.
It's going to be a fiery debate, but we're going to gang up on you, Josh.
Oh, no. Okay, I'm staying out of this. I'm. It's interesting because I have claimed for myself the title really over the last year, even a whole year. I would say I've been calling myself a tentative theonomist because I realize I'm a sophomore in Reformed theology. Like, I'm the wise fool. I've learned enough to know some things, but I have learned enough now to know that I'm still a beginner in this. So I like theonomy. I like general equity theonomy in the way that you've laid it out, Pastor Wilson. But then at a conference, I actually got to meet Dr. Rigney. This was last summer. And you just put a rock in my shoe about some natural law.
That's what he does.
I'm telling you. Yeah.
All the time.
I'm telling you. And so now, Two Kingdoms Natural Law, I was like, okay, I can't just call myself a theonomist. I need to understand both sides. I need to understand. And as I've talked to both of you, as well as Toby Sumter and Chocolate Knox and others, I've realized that this is really this political theology it's really a work of recovery, it seems like. It's an excavation work where it seems like there's a lot of work that was done that was lost in the evangelical world. And now it's like, I thought it would be easy. Oh, here's this argument. I can just put them together. But then the more I talk to you guys, the more I realize, oh, we're really working some of this stuff out in real time and how it applies and how it should apply in the United States and in our particular context. So that's enough of me talking. I'm going to let you guys actually kind of frame the debate a little bit. And we'll start off by just giving Pastor Wilson, I'd like to pass it to you for 5 minutes to just kind of set up the discussion, frame the debate a little bit, and then we'll see. Hopefully, Pastor Rigney agrees. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he wants to add to that, but then we'll bounce it over to him. So let me pass the mic over to you, Pastor Wilson, so you can kind of set up this discussion between theonomy and natural law.
Okay. So the way I understand this whole thing, it's largely a question of starting points. We all know where we are now, but how did we get here? Where did I begin my investigation of all these things? Where did Joe begin? And so forth. And then when we talk about this debate in the public square, we have to start where most messes start, which is on the internet. So out there in the world of Twitter, in the world of X, there are natural law natural law advocates and theonomists who are at each other's throats, savagely attacking one another, which is, in my thinking, absurd. Because if we were in the middle of the Biden administration, and if I were a natural law guy and someone replaced Biden with biblical theonomy, I'd be thrilled out of my brains. And then flip it around. If I'm a theonomist and the natural law guys, instead of the secularists, were suddenly running the show, I'd be thrilled out of my brains. So either option here would be a vast improvement over the secularism thing that we have going on right now. So with that said, that's the starting point of the rancorous debate out there, which in my view need not be a rancorous debate and must be a cordial discussion. There's a lot of ground to cover, and you indicated, Josh, why there's a lot of ground to cover, and that's because this is a matter of recovery. So we've got a lot of debris to clear up. So with that said, theonomy takes as its starting point the revelation of God in Scripture, and among theonomists, you could have a strict theonomist, someone like Greg Bahnsen, for example, who simply wants to bring the laws of the Old Testament over into the modern world and implement them, except at those places where the New Testament expressly says that we shouldn't. No animal sacrifices, for example, but everything else we just bring straight across. Then you would have a much more subdued presuppositional theonomist, someone like John Frame, who would say that we take the principles of God's law and we start there and we implement those principles. Now, I would be closer to Frame than I am to Bahnsen, although I think some of Bahnsen's criticisms of Frame are probably telling. I'm somewhere midpoint between Frame and Bahnsen in what I'm arguing here. Now, here's the setup. King Alfred basically instituted the laws of Deuteronomy as the laws of England. He just brought theonomy straight across. But when he did that, he was doing it in a country that was largely an agricultural nation that was very much like Israel. There wasn't that huge a difference. So he brought the laws of Deuteronomy across, implemented them, and that was the basis of English common law. Okay, it was a case law system. So it wasn't just the content of the law; it was the structure of the law, the way the law based on precedent and so forth. Which is why I'm fond of saying, if you take Alfred and Deuteronomy and add 500 years, if you take Rushdoony and add 500 years, you get Althusius. So if you start with God's law and then take it out across centuries, you get Joe Rigney's position. Okay?
Yeah, I'm the post-mill version. I'm the good.
That's right.
I'm on board.
Well, post-millennialism is messy, as you know. So there's two major adjustments. Okay, one would be when Alfred did that, it was sort of a straight up proposition. We are dealing with a major industrial. We're dealing with a major industrialized nation, which Alfred wasn't. So even though I still want to bring the laws of God to bear, it's not as straightforward and as simple as it was in Alfred's day. And then, secondly, it's a matter of scale. And thinking in terms of principles. This is one of the reasons why I'd be closer to Frame's position. In biblical law, in Mosaic law, there's virtually nothing about water rights. Okay, nothing about water rights. And in the United States, we've got 17,000 miles of rivers. We have to sort this out. We must think in terms of principles, which is why I've adopted a general equity position where we take the general equity theonomy. We take the principles of the Old Testament law and apply them in the light of Christian prudence. Last thing, a critique of the two things about natural law that I want to avoid would be those natural law theorists who believe that natural law would be authoritative and binding whether or not there's a God. Okay, whether or not there's a God, I just find that I can't get my mind around it at all. I don't want to have anything to do with that. And then secondly, I want to avoid any approach to natural law, which I would prefer to call natural revelation, that sets aside the clear teaching of Scripture on the basis of what God is, quote unquote, telling us in nature.
Okay. That's good. That's helpful. As we frame the debate before we jump into the opening statements, Dr. Rigney, would you want to add anything to that, or how would you want to? I'll give you a few minutes to kind of frame the debate as well.
Yeah. So part of the problem we're going to have here is that Doug and I are going to end up agreeing on probably most things, but maybe one of the and that's what part of why this gets complicated is because there's different pathways to get places. So I've never been a theonomist. I read a little bit of like a Van Til in college, but never read Rushdoony. Maybe read a little bit of Bonson, but more on apologetics, not political stuff. And all of my political theology was built out by reading guys like Althusius or Richard Hooker, the stuff that the Davenant Institute put out, and it made a lot of sense. Calvin, things like that. And so in my head, I think that probably the places where, say, Doug and I are going to lean in different directions, maybe, is going to be related to questions of how much weight you put on prudence and wisdom as leaving things open versus how much things are specified. I think that's definitely true in relation to some even of the stricter theonomists that Doug was mentioning, where here's the Bible verse from Deuteronomy. We just apply it just straight across. And structurally, I would be more prone to see, like, for example, the civil laws of Israel as themselves applications. And so again, to go back, so this is where we agree, but you're going to go back and find the principle, and there's going to be some, latitude for statesmen to wisely apply that in different contexts, different circumstances. And therefore, when I've had conversations with other theonomists, that's been more of the tension or the places where we disagree. Is I would say there is a kind of, in a good way, a kind of simplicity to, well, just there's the verse. What's your problem? Like, we should just do that, like an Alfred. And I think that there's a lot to commend that at one level. And at the same time, think that our confessions and the scriptures themselves leave things in some ways, establish those general principles, say summarized in the 10 Commandments, the moral law. These are the things that we should aim at. We should worship God in the way that he wants, honor the Sabbath, protect his name, honor authorities, protect life, protect marriage, protect property, protect truth and legal system. Those are sort of the big ticket aims. And then the means to get there are largely matters of wisdom and concrete circumstances. And so I worry sometimes about an over specification of the means. So that sometimes what I would say, and I think this is something that afflicts not just like the theonomy debates, but when I've debated more, say, with Baptists or those who are classical liberals, those who are really, really big on individual liberty and really like what they think is the American system, or at least the American system as it's existed in the last 50 years. basically, sometimes what seems like happens is they've taken one application of Christian principles in a particular place to a particular people, and they've absolutized it. They've made it the ideal blueprint. There is one way. And that's another place where I think some of the debate gets, that's a key question is there one sort of ideal blueprint for society that we need to impose? And that smacks to me of a kind of ideological approach to these questions rather than a biblical approach, which instead makes room for the different circumstances on the ground, allows for variations depending on the people and the character and the time and the size and all of these other factors, which is much messier. And if I were to critique that position, my position, I think prudence sounds like a big hole that you could just drive a bus through.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, what people want is something more simple, like because God says so. Thus saith the Lord. That settled it. And now we don't have to do the hard work of prudence. So, and I feel the force of that. I think that there's ways in which allowing for prudential considerations can be a kind of way that bad people do bad things in the name of prudence. So that would be a few other things to kind of stir into the pot.
Okay, that's helpful to kind of set this up. My goal is to really get to where you guys actually disagree. That's what I'm hoping we can get there, because I want to see how that turns out. And well, it's really just I'm hosting this debate partially for me, because I really want to understand these two positions, and I've been going back and forth, and I've been hearing objections from each side, and I'm like, oh, that makes sense. Oh, that makes sense. And so, so I'm looking forward to seeing if we can get down to what we really disagree on here.
So the key disagreement would be I myself give no weight at all to prudence.
Okay. Well, that'll help as we move forward, especially when we get into maybe some questions, some Q&A time towards the end. So let's just we've got a good framing for the debate. Why don't we just pass it over to you, Pastor Wilson, if you'll just make your case essentially in 10 to 15 minutes for why you call yourself a general equity theonomist, rather than you even said that you would prefer the term natural revelation to natural law, and maybe you can unpack that a little bit. And in particular, it would be interesting to have you guys explore, and we talked a little bit about this beforehand, explore the two different Westminster issues regarding the civil magistrate. Pastor Wilson, you just posted something about that on your blog and Mayblog recently. So perhaps that can be a helpful place of disagreement as kind of a launching pad for you guys, and make your case for why you hold your position. So I'll pass it over to you for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll go from there.
So I would begin with a little autobiographical note. Like Joe touched on where he was first introduced to the whole topic of the intersection of the Christian faith and our shared political life. My experience is very different. I first got involved in that integration as a result of Francis Schaeffer's work with pro-life stuff in the late 70s. And then all through the 80s, I read a boatload of the Reconstructionist stuff, because they were the only people that I knew of that were trying to integrate biblical faith with our social, cultural, and political life. So I never became a card-carrying Reconstructionist, but I sure read a lot of them. I read Gary North, and I read Bonson, and I read a lot of Rushdoony, and learned an awful lot. But that was where they were coming. They were coming from a Van Tillian presuppositional approach and a theonomic approach, and I learned an awful lot from them, and am greatly indebted to them. Without ever having I never got my union card. I never got that, but I was greatly indebted to them all through the 80s. So consequently, that was my introduction. That's what I was steeped in. That's how I was thinking. But there was always something. There was something that I didn't. I was hesitant about when I was interacting with the true blue theonomists. Joe touched on this matter of people who just want to bring everything straight across. Consequences be damned. Let's just obey the Bible. There were people debating, for example, whether execution of a criminal by a firing squad was permissible, because in the Bible, the the form of execution was stoning. And so people could argue, well, what are bullets but very small stones hurled at a high rate of speed? And so that kind of fastidiousness about, we've got to cross all the T's and dot all the I's and so forth. I take Joe's point that is, you're trying to construct God's law for complicated human societies as though God's law were made out of pressure treated 4x4s. And God's law is not that way. So as a theonomist, I want to recognize that theonomy has a built-in suppleness to it. In other words, it's not just this it's not a Procrustean bed for human societies to try to adapt themselves to. One of the glorious features of theonomy is that it adapts to changing circumstances. And we can see that even within the pages of Scripture themselves. God gives Moses the law on tablets of stone. They go in the period of Judges. And then when the people ask for a king, God is displeased with them because they've rejected him, not because they've asked for a king, but because they wanted a king like the other nations. So in Deuteronomy 17, under the law of Moses, it anticipated the establishment of the monarchy. It anticipated Israel having a king. So there's no sinfulness in having a king, but there was sinfulness in having a tyrant or having someone who in principle could easily become a tyrant. And that's what Samuel warns the people about in 1 Samuel 8. This king you've asked for, he's going to do this and this and this and this. The people don't want it. They don't want that, but they still want a king. And it says that Samuel, I think it's in chapter 10, writes up a new constitution and he lays it before the Lord. So it's like there's a shift from the Mosaic administration to the monarchy, and Samuel drafts a constitution for Israel to function with the monarchy, and he sets it before the Lord. And then later, under Solomon, there's a shift from tribal government to administrative districts. So as Israel grows and flourishes, there's yet another shift, and there's no condemnation in Scripture of these changes. So one of the things that I think we have to recognize about God's law is that it is not it'd be false to say that God's law is ill-suited to adaptation. Adaptation is one of the features of theonomy. And that's why I came to, through various circuitous routes, I came to what I call general equity theonomy. And that phrase comes from the Westminster Confession of Faith, where it divides the law of God into three categories. There's the ceremonial law, which is fulfilled in Christ. So all parties to this debate agree that we don't sacrifice bulls and goats anymore because that was fulfilled in Christ. The festivals of Israel, the holiness code, the holiness codes and whatnot. The ceremonial law was all fulfilled in Christ, as the Westminster Confession says. Then the second type of law is the moral law. The moral law is binding in every age. Every creature, no matter where they live in human history, must honor God as God, must not make graven images, must not commit adultery, and so on. So the moral law is fixed and constant. Okay, thus far the Westminster Confession of Faith. Then the Westminster says that there is judicial law, the law that was tailored to the existence of the nation of Israel. Okay, the laws that God gave them as a people. An example of that kind of law would be they required a balustrade to be put around the roofs of houses, and that was because in the ancient Near East, people would go up on the top of their houses in the evening to cool off. It was the equivalent of a second-story deck, and so the law required a balustrade to be put around the roof of the house. That would be an example of judicial law. A theonomist today does not have to advocate for building codes to be changed so that every house in America needs to have a rail around, running along the gutters. Even though nobody ever goes up there, we've got to put the balustrade up there because theonomy. Well, what the Westminster Confession of Faith says is that these judicial laws that were tailored for Israel's condition, they say an existence. The confession says that these laws have expired together with the nation that they were for. So when Israel as a nation went out of existence, the laws for Israel also went out of existence, except, the confession says, as the general equity thereof may require. So there's a principle there that can be applied in modern times. Excuse me. And that principle is that a homeowner is responsible for the safety of his guests. So let's say a modern court case comes up in a biblical republic, and somebody falls off of somebody's second story deck, and they didn't have a guardrail there. And a judge could find that the homeowner was liable for medical expenses because he didn't have a balustrade around his second story deck, and he could cite that passage, even though it's a deck, not a roof, even though it's America, not Israel, and so on. So that's a general equity application. Now, that's why I call myself a general equity theonomist, as opposed to a strict theonomist that simply wants to take the laws of Moses, pick them up with a grappling hook, bring them over and drop them down on top of America. So that's the breakdown of theonomy. I'm a general equity theonomist, and that requires, despite my joke earlier, that requires a goodly amount of prudence. Okay, you have to figure out in all good conscience what this all means. So the next thing I want to touch on, and then I'll yield the floor, is the thing you mentioned about the Westminster Confession of Faith and the magistrate. So there's no confusion, there are two main versions of the Westminster Confession. There's the 1647. That's
right, 1647
version of the Westminster Confession, the original Westminster Confession, which is the one that our church subscribes to. And then in 1789, the First General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in America adopted a modified version of the Westminster Confession, and one of the principal modifications was in chapter 23 on the civil magistrate. Okay, now our church has adopted the original Westminster Confession, but one of the exceptions that we take as a church is to the last phrase in the third paragraph of chapter 23, where it says, chapter 23 says that the civil magistrate has the authority to call synods and councils, but he must not interfere with the power of the keys of the church. He's got to respect the independence of the church. But then the last phrase of paragraph 3 says that he has the authority to ensure that the decisions of the church are conform to the mind of God. Okay, now we understand that last phrase to be Erastian, and so we take an exception to it. What that does is it moves our church's position slightly to the left of the original Westminster Confession, but still a healthy distance to the right of the American revision. So we don't have the American revision, but even so, the American revision, even in its watered down condition, not allowing the magistrate to have as many prerogatives as the original did, even the American version is a Christian nationalist version, because the American version says that the magistrate must be solicitous for the welfare of the churches of our common Lord. So the American Westminster requires the magistrate play no favorites among Christian denominations. Okay. And so consequently, a PCA pastor who subscribes to the American Westminster, if he is opposed to Christian nationalism, he needs to take an exception to Westminster 23, the American version. So now I should define Erastianism. Erastianism is the view originally articulated by Thomas Erastus in the 16th century, saying that the church should be subservient to the state. So basically, the church or churches are under the authority of the state, and the state can determine what goes on and what does not. The Westminster Confession of Faith was a consensus document. There were anti-Erastians in the assembly, and there were Erastians in the assembly. And I believe that as a consensus document, that last phrase was, in the best case scenario, very poorly phrased, looking like it gave the magistrate the authority to convene a synod, and then tell the synod whether or not they ask their advice, and then tell the synod whether or not they got the right answer. Right? Advise me, please, and here's the right answer. Now, so we take exception to that last phrase, but to that last phrase only. It's fine for a magistrate to call a synod. It's fine for him to ask for their input and advice. It's not fine for him to dictate to the church what the Bible says. So he should at that point he should be listening and taking notes and not instructing, not wielding authority over the assembly. Last thing, the assembly was divided, so you had strong advocates of the independence of the church, like the Scottish commissioners to the assembly, Gillespie and Rutherford. They were strong advocates of the Presbyterian position, which I hold. But there were also men like Selden and Lightfoot who were strong Erastians. And the Westminster Assembly was convened by Parliament, which was a reformed Parliament, but also robustly a very Erastian Parliament. They did think they were in charge. And so I want to lean against that. I want to be careful to insist on the independence of the church. So there's much to pursue there, but that's basically it.
Excellent introduction. Thank you for that, Pastor Wilson. And before I pass the mic over to Dr. Rigney, we got 95 people here watching. If you guys could go like this video right now, it really helps. It helps a lot. Liking, commenting, all that stuff helps the algorithm boost it out to as many people as possible. And last thing before we pass the mic, if you want your question answered for the live Q&A, put in all caps question and then put the name, either Pastor Wilson or Dr. Rigney, of who you're asking the question to, and then put your question. Okay. All caps, who are you asking the question to, and then ask the question. And then I'm collecting those for the end. So with that, let's pass it over to you, Dr. Rigney.
Yeah. So I agree wholly down the line with Doug on the three aspects or layers of the Mosaic Law, the tripartite division. I think that's a classic. It's not just a reformed one. Aquinas does something similar. And I think it's helpful to think of that more as like layers to the law rather than trying to carve up particular. It's not like you have three buckets and you have to go through all 600 and some odd laws of Israel and put them in one of the buckets. There you go. Because you would find out pretty quickly, well, that certain laws would seem like they would go in both the ceremonial and the civil, or both the moral and the civil. And instead, it's better to think of those as sort of layers. It's those categories, those divisions are things we come to by analysis. We recognize that there's an aspect of this law that is universal, moral, and abiding on all people. And then there's an aspect of this law that was particular to Israel. And I think Doug's explanation of general equity at going through the judicial laws in order to arrive at the abiding moral principle, which we then have to apply. I think that's basically right. So maybe I'll spend more of my time thinking about the differences between Westminster 1647, which is when it was adopted. Some people say 1646 because that's when it was written. It was adopted by the Church of Scotland in 1647. So same thing with the American, written in 1788, adopted 1789. And I'm not an expert on these. I rely on other people to point me to stuff. So if I get details wrong, I'm open to correction. I'm less convinced that 1647 is itself Erastian, even in that final line. But I do think there's a difference between the original and the American version that has to do with actually the adaptability that Doug mentioned. I think that the original was adapted to a British European context that had state churches and that thought that was a fine and good way to do it, and that wanted to sort of recognize different governments, the ecclesiastical government and the civil government, wanted them to stay in their lanes, but also wanted them to work together. That maybe another way to get at some of the debate, we could get into this when we go back and forth in a bit, is actually about kind of Kuyperian impulses, where the spheres of government, the state and the church, for example, can be treated as though they are walled off from each other, and everybody needs to stay in their lane and there's no overlap. And I think the 1647 is a good instance of, while they are distinct governments and they have different tools, the state has the sword, the church has the keys, they have different tools. They work together to accomplish shared ends. They both want, say, pious, just, righteous societies, and they work in concert to that end, and they can actually influence each other and have some overlap there. So when the 1647 says that the civil magistrate doesn't have the power of the keys, it can't administer the keys, it's not in charge of church discipline, I think that's a rejection of Erastianism. My understanding of Erastianism is that it gave the state authority in church discipline. It gave the state authority within the church, whereas the Westminster Confession is trying to give the state some authority around the church or about the church with reference to the church, but preserving distinct prerogatives and authority for the church itself. It's the church that should administer the word, the sacraments, exercise church discipline, have the power of the keys. But the 1647 goes on to say that I'm looking at it right now, that the civil magistrate has authority and it's his duty to take order, and then it gives a bunch of things that he's sort of responsible for. He's to provide for these things, and then it explains how he's to provide for these things. And so the things that the magistrate has authority over would be things like preserve the unity and peace of the church, keep the truth of God pure and entire, suppress blasphemies and heresies, as well as reform corruptions and abuses in worship, make sure that all of the ordinance of God are settled and administered and observed. So that sounds like he's supposed to do something in terms of things that we would normally think of as internal church business, right? Worship, blasphemy, heresy, discipline, ordinances. The magistrate, according to that confession, has some responsibility to take order that happens. But then it goes on to say, how should he do that? Well, for the better effecting of those things, what's the means? He has power to call synods. If he calls a synod, so say the situation in view is something like there's controversies in the church over how you should worship, or over some doctrinal questions, and it's causing disruption in a Christian society. People are at each other's throats, and the magistrate, his main responsibility under God is to preserve and order society in a healthy and God-honoring way. And so these divisions are bad, and so he should take order that something be done about it. What should he do? He should call a synod. It says he can be present at it, so he can sit there as sort of he's not moderating or presiding over it. He's allowed to be there. And then this is the line that Doug mentioned that he finds objectionable on Erastian grounds, is it provide that whatever is transacted is according to the mind of God. And I do think that there is at least a little bit of ambiguity, especially 3 centuries on, at what that might mean. Does it mean that he has the ability to kind of give his final approval? If he doesn't like the answer that the synod comes back with, can he say no and get rid of it? I don't think that's what's in view. I think what's more in view is something like part of his responsibility is, as the synod conducts his business, is to make sure that interested parties, like the politicians, the economic interests that might want to tip the scales, are kept out of the deliberations. He's like a policeman when a policeman comes to do traffic duty outside of a big mega church in Texas, which they do. He's present, he's protecting, he's guarding the church, he's making sure that nobody disrupts it. But he's not the one preaching. He's not the one deciding the question. He's making sure that the question can get decided without the wrong kinds of pressures intruding. So transacted according to the mind of God means transacted in a godly way, that the way they went about this was right. It wasn't bribery. It wasn't cultural pressures. It wasn't any of those things. He's trying to keep all of those things out of the matter. And then, so that's, I think, Westminster. Along with that, there's other parts of the confession that say things like there's only one head of the church, and it's the Lord Jesus, which is a rejection both of the papacy, but also any form of civil supremacy over the church. So the kind of thing that, say, Henry V or Henry VIII is the head of the Church of England. It's a rejection of that way of thinking. Instead, it's the king's not the head of the church. The pope's not the head of the church. God has instituted a government in the church, it says, that's distinct from the civil government. So there really are these two different governments, but they are designed to work in tandem. And I think one of the places that Americans flinch at the original Westminster is this notion that the state, the magistrate, has a vested interest or some sort of responsibility to make sure that the church's business is in order. But I think that it limits his direct authority to accomplish it. He can get the people in the room to make it happen, but he's not the one who actually is supposed to reform the abuses in worship or settle the ordinance of God's rightly. That's for the ministers to sort out. He's to make sure that they get together and that they get it done according to the mind of God. You flip over to the 1789 version, and I think that this is an adaptation to an American context, which had lots of different Christian denominations in view. And so in that sense, it's very much a consensus document that, like the American Constitution, for example, doesn't want the federal government or doesn't want the federal government insisting or privileging or preferencing one Christian denomination over another. So in that sense, it's a kind of mere Protestant confession, which I like in principle. In other words, I think that's a good way to do it. I don't think it's the only way to do it. And I think that's another question we could get at maybe in a moment. So when 1789 says that, protect the church of our common Lord, but no preference to any Christian denomination, what that means is, according to the American Presbyterians, you couldn't have a Presbyterian state or a Lutheran state or an Anglican state where you privileged either with tax benefits or civil rights. Only Presbyterians can vote here. The American version says the magistrate is forbidden to do that. Whereas I would say, I think that that's in bounds. I think if you have a state that has a lot of Lutherans in it, it's a 90% Lutheran, conservative Lutheran state, and they decide we want our government to be Lutheran, and all elected officials need to be Lutherans, and only people who can vote are Lutherans. I think there's nothing in the Bible that would forbid them from doing that. That's perfectly legitimate for them to do. Whereas I think American Westminster would say the magistrate can't do that. That's forbidden for them to do. And then the same thing would be true of the later parts where, make sure that basically the American version adopts a kind of voluntary principle, which I think the original Westminster was trying to avoid. The voluntary principle being you choose your own church, you choose your own denomination, and all of those choices need to be equally respected in law, and there's no privileging of one over another. It's a wider toleration. And again, I think that's one way to do it. And it may be a really good way to do it. It's worked pretty well in America for 150 years or so. But part of the question on this is it the only way to do it? And I think I would point to actually both versions of Westminster as applications of common Reformed principles in different historical circumstances. So I think it actually demonstrates the point about prudence, which Doug and I agree on, in that the divines who are setting this down are trying to sort of codify what is our doctrine, and preserve it in that way. But it's codified at a particular time and place with particular circumstances on the ground and with differences of opinion. And so there is a consensus element to it. So that's probably enough there on the kind of differences. So I don't think that 1647 is an Erastian document. Even if there were Erastians, I don't know enough about the makeup of the assembly to say one way or the other. But I think in and of itself, it actually rejects Erastianism. The church, the state can't interfere in internal church matters, but it needs to make sure that internal church matters are settled and done in a way that honors God, is the way that God would want it. As we kind of kick back in, maybe one interesting place to go on the law question that Doug brought up, because I think this would be a place where we might differ, is he mentioned the parapets or the barriers around a roof, and I agreed with his application. We don't have to have them just because Israel did, but a fence around a swimming pool on your property, you're liable if you don't have one. Part of the question would be whether or not it's lawful for the state to anticipate and require parapets ahead of time, as opposed to only punishing people if something bad happens. In other words, things like building codes, right? So this is one of the places where you can sometimes feel a difference between people who ostensibly agree on a lot of principles. But would our building codes lawful, or zoning codes that say you can't have certain businesses or you can't have certain types of businesses or homes or schools in certain places that we reserve them? Are those sorts of laws permissible? Or are those sorts of laws a violation of biblical law? That's not the way that biblical law should work. That'd be an interesting question to get into in a minute.
Yeah, that's great. In fact, those are some of the exact questions that really started to lead me to dig into this and try to understand. So yeah, let's get into that. Before we pass it over to Pastor Wilson to kind of have his time of a little bit of cross-examination and destroying Dr. Rigney with facts and logic or whatever, before we get there, I want to ask you guys, first of all, I want to say that this episode is brought to you by our wonderful sponsors. And you guys who are watching live won't see the commercials, but for those of you who are watching later, listening later, you guys will hear from them in a more robust fashion with a full-on commercial. But for now, this episode is brought to you by Resurrection Design, a Christian graphic design company, Joe Garrisi with Backwards Planning Financial, David Reece with Armored Republic and Reece Fund, and Mount Athos Performance. Those guys are helping keep the lights on. And it's also brought to you by our club members. A lot of you guys are watching. You guys, I am so thankful for you guys. I know some of you have been thinking about it for a while. Just join the Knox tier. Come join the book club. You get the Minavista car tumbler. You get lots of cool, fun stuff. You get to be a part of our community. So join our club membership. And with that, let's pass the mic over to Pastor Wilson. And so, yeah, this is 10 minutes or so, 10 to 15 minutes of just asking the questions, and try to keep the answers kind of tight. That way we can get to, but we'll just see where it goes. But with that, we'll pass it over to you, Pastor.
All right, we'll see where it goes. I'll start with what Joe brought up at the last there, but I do want to make a point of getting back to Westminster 23. Again, there's a lot to agree on, but I think there are some differences there. On building codes, I'll respond by saying what I think should be the mechanism, and then, Joe, you can tell me what you think of that. I would not want building inspectors. I would want a building code, but not want building inspectors who would sign off beforehand. Okay, so I don't want the inspector to come around and say you can't live in this house until you have that railing up. But I do want to have the law say that if someone falls off your deck, you are liable for that. In other words, the fact that there was no railing and he should have watched his step is no defense. So basically, every homeowner would be subject to penalties if there's an accident, but you don't create an apparatus that tries to head off the accidents beforehand. What would you think of that?
Yeah. So, well, I think I asked a question. Not having building inspectors, is that the law of God or the biblical law forbids inspectors, or I think it would be unwise to have inspectors because they're likely to become busybodies, and that's going to give the state too much. In other words, is it a wisdom thing or a absolute prohibition thing?
I don't take it as a prohibition thing. I would say, since the law of God requires prudence, and centuries of experience have told us that when you give an officious person a busybody license, they start to act like a busybody. So Christian theonomic prudence would dictate that we ought not to invest authorities with that kind of authority.
Okay, yeah, good. So on those grounds, I think that's a really reasonable way to approach it. So you would be you'd have some kind of guidelines or standards that would be published, and the builders would have to do it, homeowners would have to consult it, and if they failed to do something, if they decided to shortcut, then and something were to go wrong, they're going to be liable for whatever went wrong, and that would so I think that's but you don't have anybody coming in to sign off after every stage of when I've done construction, that's how it works, right? You finish that, somebody from the government comes in to sign off. I don't think that it's I probably don't think it's as unwise. I recognize the danger of officious busybodies, and I think that's more of symptomatic. I think basically, if we had a moral and religious people, then I think you could have inspectors stay in their lane in a better way. So I think that's how I'd go with that one. Is that okay. So probably agree wisdom call. Agree that it's a wisdom call, and probably less skeptical, or I think it could be reasonable to have inspectors too.
Okay, and just to be clear, I think it's perfectly reasonable to have the government establish the code. In other words, what are best practices? Concrete parking garages should have rebar in them. That's the code. It's like the government defining weights and measures, or here's a troy ounce of gold or a troy ounce of silver is this, and so that you have the definitions established by the government, and then the only way the government could intervene would be if there's fraud. So if someone is advertising, I'm selling these troy ounces of silver, but they're not, if they're diluting the wine, if they're corrupting the silver and gold, if they are fudging on the building, if they sell a building to someone and we say the studs are 16 inches apart, and then the homeowner bought the house, there's been no accident, all right, but the homeowner discovers when he's doing a remodel that the studs are 20 inches apart, then there's something actionable there, because the government has defined what the standard is. Does that fit with what you're saying?
Yeah, I think it does. And that's part of why I'm at least open to inspectors, because of the possibility, because when it comes to things like home construction, certain things can be covered up and not be a problem for a long time, and therefore establishing liability when the home was built 100 years ago by somebody who's dead. And yet, so it had somebody been going in to check before they put the drywall up, or before they put the foundation, after they've done the foundation, that, the rebar's in there, we're good. And therefore, as a kind of, so the state calculus would be something like, in order to avoid really destructive risk, and this is where the prudence really does come into play, right? A parking garage collapsing, lots of people might die. The studs being an inch or two off seems like in a different kind, like it's degrees of severity. And so having a sense of proportion, and I think this is probably a place where we do agree on, whatever you do, because law doesn't apply itself. Like, laws establish things, but they always have to be applied. You always have to have wise people, moral people, godly people to apply the laws, because it doesn't, if you could have the greatest law in the world, like say God gave you one, let's just imagine for a second that God gave you a law as a people. Do you think it's ever possible that a wicked group of people, I don't know, like a Pharisee or something, could take that really holy and righteous law and do really, really great wicked things with it? And of course, the answer is yes. Even the best laws in the hands of wicked men just give them more creative ways to sin. And so there's no protection against that. But the question is one of kind of risk management and prudence. So, but I think that maybe we don't disagree as much as I'd hoped on that.
So let's go back just to gratify Josh to an area where I think we do disagree, and that is back to
Thank you.
Westminster 23. It's a really interesting quirk of history that the Westminster Assembly finished its work and submitted everything to Parliament. Parliament was large. Basically, you people think that there were the Reformed on one side and the Tories on the other. Actually, you had multiple different groups. Parliament was dominated by the Independents, and the Westminster Assembly was dominated by the Presbyterians. But they also had independents in the assembly, and they also had people who were Erastian in their sympathies in the assembly. Now, when the assembly sent the document back to Parliament, Parliament sent it back to them and said, "We want scripture proofs." So the original Westminster had no proof texts, and Parliament sent it back to them and said, "Give us some proof texts." So the thing that's interesting about that last phrase in 23 is if you look at the proof texts that the assembly attached to them, they were proof texts that largely had to do with the behavior of reforming kings in Israel, Hezekiah, and so basically the proof texts, if you were looking for something that those proof texts proved, sort of in a prima facie way, it would be proving that the magistrate does have the authority to come in to mess around with internal affairs of the church. Now, I'm in this whole thing. I'm following and am in agreement with James Bannerman's great book, The Church of Christ. So he's a 19th century Reformed Scottish writer, and he has a long section on the spiritual independence of the church. So men like Hooker, who was an establishment Anglican, was in effect an Erastian, and this was a hot issue for the Reformed throughout the whole course of the Reformation. Pierre Viret, who became was a friend of Calvin's, left Basel because the city council, which was Protestant, wouldn't let him discipline a man who was running a brothel out of his mom's house. So Viret wanted to discipline this man, and the civil magistrate, Protestant civil magistrate, wouldn't let him discipline him. So he comes to Calvin. Calvin runs afoul of the Geneva authorities on similar grounds. So this was an ongoing tension between Protestant magistrates and Protestant theologians. Now, I'm with the independence of the church people, but people like Hooker and people like Selden tended to see the one body politic that had two aspects. You had this is us at church, and this is us deciding how we're going to run the traffic laws. The Scots Presbyterians insisted on the church and the state being distinct realities with an ontological identity of their own. And then Bannerman argues for it's fully appropriate for these two governments to make an alliance and to talk to each other and to work out a friendly arrangement, but they're not the same entity. You have to insist on that independence. So when I look at that last phrase, I want to take an exception to it. If it's badly phrased, I agree that there are anti-Erastian elements in the Westminster Confession also, very distinctly. Bannerman says, the way Bannerman phrases it is the ideal circumstance is that the magistrate has authority in things circa sacra, things surrounding sacred things, but he has no authority in sacris, in sacred things. So I think that that's a good distinction. Having said that, and this is a long run up to my quick question for you. Having said that, if we look at history, let's say Constantine deposes an Arian bishop. Okay, well, that's in sacris. That, you know, he stepped right in there and did a good thing. And we might be a little dubious about his right to do it, but happy with the result, right? And the nice and tidy circa sacra in sacris sometimes doesn't work in the hurly-burly of history, right? So you might have a magistrate, a reforming magistrate, who steps in to deal with a hopelessly corrupt church. Yeah, let's say the church went all LGBTQ, and the magistrate said nothing doing. Now what do we do? So what would you do?
Yeah, so I think those are really good examples, actually, and that's why, so I went and pulled up the text just to see, and it is interesting, so they quote Jehoshaphat calling the Levites and saying, do your stuff in the fear of the Lord. And you're looking, that sounds good. Okay, yeah. And then you get to the bottom, and it's when it includes as a support for transacted according to the mind of God, the passage in Matthew where Herod gathers the chief priests and scribes to figure out where Jesus would be born. Yeah. And you go, oh, that was so. To your point, sometimes those synods are not called for good reasons or transact, and maybe they're using that as this would be transacted not according to the mind of God. I don't know.
Or maybe they're just trying to get Parliament to lay off.
Yeah, right. So just throw some Bible verses in there. They're probably not going to read the fine print anyway. Yeah, so I think that it does raise that question, though, of reforming magistrates and how far can their reforms extend? And this is kind of a common debate in relation to like Baptists or other lower church independent Congregationalists, because typically what they'll say is the magistrate has jurisdiction over horizontal stuff, right? So can the magistrate reform your marriage laws and your murder laws and your theft laws? Of course, that's their proper jurisdiction, but they need to keep their hands entirely out of anything vertical. And I think I think we both agree that's an untenable position, because right. The second table of the law is built on the first, and it's not a question of whether but which, and all of the sort of baseline things that we'd share. But then when you start to ask, what would it mean for the magistrate to suppress heresy or to take order that heresy be suppressed, which is the way it's phrased. So it's an interesting, the Westminster does it interestingly, and it says it gives him the responsibility to make sure it happens, but it doesn't necessarily give him it doesn't require him to be the direct agent of the suppression of the false doctrine or blasphemy. And so it leaves it open that that the way he would do it would be to basically poke the church leaders, get them in gear, saying, hey, there's a bunch of junk going on. You guys need to get together and clear it out. And then your question is, and what if they don't? What if he convenes the synod and the synod is so corrupt that they sanction sodomy?
Right.
Does he have any recourse as a godly magistrate to say, okay, fine, you're now, we're going to take your churches and give them to this faithful remnant over here? And I think in principle, that's lawful. You'd have to have, the structures would need to be built to do it, but that in the faith, like in the same way that we want to say that the church could preach and correct the magistrate when he's getting out, sort of a John the Baptist to Herod, you're not allowed to have your brother's wife, knock it off. I think similarly, the magistrate could correct the church if the church was going off the rails. And you say, well, at what level? If they don't have the right vestments, that was a big controversy at various times in England. And this is where prudence, in some sense of proportion and propriety, I think it's actually one of the places where theological triage and those tripartite division of the law comes into play, as establishing what are the weightier matters of the law, what are the doctrines that are of first important. And the confessions typically have some language like that of doctrines that attack the foundations of the faith or something in order to distinguish, say, Trinitarian heresy and big ticket items from intramural Christian stuff. Is Jesus going to come back on a Tuesday or a Wednesday? That kind of thing. Right. And we don't want the magistrate or the church being officious about that question.
Another way of saying this perhaps would be, you mentioned this would be lawful. I would say, I'd prefer to say lawful unlawfulness. So biblical Christians have to know when it's okay to eat the showbread. When is it okay for Hezekiah to postpone Passover a month? And God blesses that sort of thing. So if the magistrate gets out of his lane, or let's say the church gets out of its lane in a failed state, let's say the civil society just collapses, and the Pope is the one who goes out to negotiate with the Lombards who have invaded Italy, or you're a churchman in Somalia and there's no state to speak, everything just disintegrates, and the church has to speak for the collective people. Well, that's okay. Life is messy, history is messy, and then there are other times when the church collapses. It's not, and the magistrate might have more on the ball than the churchmen do. Mm-hmm. But that's what we're doing, and what Bannerman does and argues for is, okay, we want to sketch what society looks like when everybody's roughly doing their job. Right.
Mm-hmm. On this note, can I ask you both a question? Because while we're here, and you guys are talking about like basically the church completely losing all its in a failed state, a LGBT church has lost all credibility. And let's take, for example, the Trump's inauguration, right after Trump's inauguration, that infamous service where you had the lady priest start going off about, LGBT stuff and all that good stuff. In principle, could President Trump stand up and say, like, in your ideal Christian society, could President Trump stood up and said, no, you're done. We're shutting this down and giving it to a faithful body or something like that. This whole church. Is there a situation where something like that would be lawful in principle? And I'm curious what you both think of that.
Yeah. So I'll answer it this way. In the circumstances in which we exist now, meaning the American system, I don't think so, because I don't think he has, like, the structures aren't in place for him to just do that. It's just he's yelling into the wind. But let's say move it over into England, and let's say you had the exact same thing happen, and instead of King Charles, you actually, one of his sons becomes an evangelical Protestant, to his back teeth, the sort of person who reads James Bannerman books, and it is going on and gets at the coronation. One of the, there's a lady bishop from the Church of England who does the same sort of thing and starts to hector him. I think in that system, he could, right? In other words, the particulars would matter, and is why it matters what kind of structures you set up in order to allow for the various kinds of checks and balances. So it would be lawful, I think, to say, if someone decided to make a show, like they have, like various, bishops have at various times, make a big to-do in front of the magistrate. If the structures are such that it allows for that check, I think it's lawful in principle for a magistrate to do that.
I agree with that. I agree with Joe there. But I would say even in America, the president would have a bully pulpit. He might not have the authority to cut off funding for that cathedral, but he could get up and walk out, or he could hold a press conference the next day with a couple of Orthodox ministers flanking him, mm-hmm. and saying, "Hey, would you guys tell the people why that lady was out to lunch?"
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. So you're saying, Pastor Wilson, that's surprising to me, but it's interesting. You're saying that you actually agree in principle that, like, in the situation that Rigney laid out in England or something like that. That in principle, the civil magistrate could perform that duty and be in accords with God's word and how.
Because that, there's a qualifier at some point that in their system, the king is the head of the church, right? And he's got an employee popping off at him, right? So now I would object to the king being the head of the church. I object to that part. It sort of goes back to Joe's illustration of a state that was overwhelmingly Lutheran, and he said that was lawful. Well, yeah, I think it would be lawful for them to govern themselves the way Joe described. I don't think it's lawful for them to be Lutheran.
Fair enough.
But that's another thing.
Well, so shifted. I'd actually be curious on that. So if in the hypothetical where the 90% Presbyterians in a given place, and they're establishing their forms of government, and they decide only Presbyterian, because we're 90%. So there are religious minorities. There's a Baptist running around. Is it lawful for them to say, we're not simply going to be generically Christian or generically Protestant, but we're going to require all of the civil magistrates to be members in good standings at one of our Presbyterian churches. In fact, we're going to go so far as only Presbyterians can vote. So sorry, Baptists, you're free to be here. You're free to, sorry, Pentecostal, sorry, Lutherans, sorry, even Dutch Reformed, maybe. Like all of you other folks, we love you. We're fellow brethren. But in terms of the governance of our state, we're Presbyterians from top to bottom. Would that be, you might not, basically, part of the questions that we're getting at here is there's a difference between a lawful law, right, or a righteous law that accords with God's law, and a wise and good law. So you could have something that's in principle lawful and still think it's a bad idea. Correct. But would that be one that you would put on the lawful side? And did you think it would be good in that circumstance?
I think it would be lawful and stupid.
Okay.
Lawful and stupid.
This is so helpful for me. It's interesting even hearing how you're articulating some of this over against how even Dr. Joe Boot was articulating some of this in your conversation, Rigney, with him. I thought that was excellent too. That was kind of a precursor for this one. Real fast before we continue, I've got some great questions here from people, but I want to know for each of you what the hard stop time is, so I know when to wrap this up.
I've got another half hour.
Half hour. What about you, Rigney?
I can probably do that. I got a little thing, but I can bump it. It's good.
Okay, that's great. We'll just call it that. We'll give it a half hour. That means we'll give another 10 minutes or so to you, Dr. Rigney, to kind of tease out some of these hypotheticals. I think you're really poking and prodding and getting at some of the actual potential disagreements, which I'm hoping to get to. And then we'll jump in the next 5 to 10 minutes, 15 at the most. We'll jump into some great Q&As. Okay. So I'll let you guys keep going with this.
Yeah. So that last category, I think, is actually a really, really, really important one. And it gets where the prudence comes into play in these discussions. You need to have a category for lawful and really stupid, right? Like that's actually a really important, where you can say technically in bounds, and it would be really, really destructive and stupid for you to do that. And then, so, here's a question. When does stupid, do you have a category for it's technically lawful, but so stupid that it's a sin?
Yeah. And that brings up another category. So there's a distinction between a sin and a crime.
Yeah.
Okay. And there are things that are mildly foolish, really, really stupid. And it's like a dimmer switch that stupid at some point becomes a moral issue. And the people are sinning by being so stupid, especially when they're grown-ups who ought to know better. So if in the American system, when the Constitution was adopted, 9 of the 13 colonies had official relationships with a particular denomination. In Connecticut, their formal relationship with the Congregational Church lasted down to the 1930s. Now, the First Amendment only applies to the federal government. They were saying, we don't want a Church of the United States, which I agree with completely. I don't want that either. At the time, Connecticut had the Congregational Church as the Church of Connecticut. There was a Church of Connecticut. Now, that means that the Connecticut arrangement was not unconstitutional. I happen to be opposed to it. If I were a resident of Connecticut, I wouldn't want establishment on the state level either. But it would be something I'm opposed to. I think would be unwise, but it wouldn't be unconstitutional.
Right.
Okay. And this is an area where I agree with the American Westminster, because I think their statement, they're just talking about this civil magistrate. They're not talking about the federal level versus state level.
Right.
What the American Presbyterians were saying is that it was not appropriate for the magistrate of Connecticut to favor the Congregationalists over the Baptists, over the Presbyterians, and so on. Now, I'm with them on that. I think that the magistrate ought to recognize the Christian faith in its Protestant form as the foundation for all of our laws for our people. We are a Christian people. And then he ought to do what the American Westminster says with all the Christian denominations, not play favorites between them. But if the Presbyterians took over one state and they denied voting rights to the Baptists and the Charismatics and so forth, I would say that that'd be really stupid, and it would be sinfully stupid. And the Presbyterians were going to pay for it dearly. They ought not to do it, but I don't think it should be a crime.
Right. Good. So widen that out, moving away from Christian denominations. How would you make the same kind of calculation if it was outside of the Christian faith? In other words, say you're not going to privilege the Christian denominations. All Christians can vote. But if they said only Christians can be magistrates, is that in bounds? Only Christians can vote. So if you're a Muslim or a Jew or an atheist, we don't want you to have a say in picking our leaders because we think you're going to pick badly. Would that be something that would that be in the same category of lawful but really, really stupid? Or would you say lawful but maybe in bounds?
Now, a lot of that I'd like to try to hammer out when we get there, but
Sure.
These would be preliminary sketches. I would say if you had a Christian republic, one of the duties of the magistrates in running that republic is to defend the identity of it. And that means defending the Christianity of it.
Right.
So, and that would mean, it seems to me, at a bare minimum, is that all office holders would need to be confessionally Christian. You couldn't hold office unless you were Christian. And then it would be an interesting debate about voting. I tend to think that you ought to limit voting to someone who limit citizenship rather to someone who is a Christian. Resident aliens could certainly live there and work and participate, but they could in the economy and in society, but they shouldn't be able to decide the future of a Christian people. Right. And I don't want them to be able to own the public space. So church bells would be lawful. Minarets would not be. Right. So this place is Christian. Now, I think that if you had that kind of scenario, I believe that Hindus and Muslims and Jews would be knocking on the door, wanting to get in. I think it would be the sort of place where they could come and thrive, because I believe that Christians would be better equipped to protect their rights as a minority than they would be equipped to protect anybody's rights.
Right. I agree with that. Maybe go back to sticking with this lawful stupid paradigm, which I think we should just make that that's lawful but stupid. Public schools, government schools. I think this is a place where I've wondered. Sometimes I think this is often I associate it with a kind of Kuyperianism, which wants to keep the sphere separate and say that the family that's not basically the education is the ministry of the family, and they're free to partner with others in a voluntary way. but you shouldn't. It's not just a question of we have secular public schools, but we have public schools at all is a kind of, and this is where my question is: it public schools are unlawful? They're contrary to the law of God. It's not in their jurisdiction. They need to get out of it. Or public schools are stupid. It's lawful but stupid. Is it? Where do you put it? Because that would be another place I think there might be a little bit different.
So what I would do there is first point out historically, Martin Luther and John Knox were sort of drivers in favor of establishing tax-supported schools. And of course, in Scotland at John Knox's time, the taxes were the tithes. Right. You paid your tithe, and because it was a Christian nation. So there's the two issues are: I'm opposed to public education in America today because they're secular, okay, not because they're tax supported. Now, I can envision a Christian republic that has a certain measure of tax support going to schools, and I think that that's foolish but lawful. But where would it become unlawful? It would be, I go back to 1 Samuel 8, where I think one of the dire problems that Samuel warns the people about is the king, once he's established, will take up to 10% of your income. Now, if our tax base went back to 10%, we would think we were living in a libertarian paradise. Samuel thought that it would be the threshold of tyranny when the magistrate is claiming as much as God does, when the magistrate is taxing you at a level that God taxes you, then he's aspiring to deity. So if you had let's say there's a municipal school for the children of impoverished parents, and the budget of it is less than 2% of the city's budget, but it is tax supported, and it's for the kids of indigents. I think that's maybe unwise, but certainly lawful. Right. If you had a school system for everybody, the way we talk now, there's no way to have that without taxing the people oppressively. And I think that would be unlawful. So it's unlawful to have a huge publicly supported Christian school.
Yeah, good. And I think that's a good place where there would be kind of this difference that we're trying to get at. So the Samuel principle of up to 10%, anything above that is a kind of aspiration to deity. I think that you probably put more weight on that biblical example than I would in terms of the lawfulness or wisdom question. So, because I have in my head, so the question of if a Christian polity, a real one, thoroughly Christian, like Europe was at one time and like America was at one time, decided they wanted to have a larger and more robust government in terms of social safety nets and things like that. I could see going, I think that's unwise. I think you're going to get there, but I don't know. I think where we would say, when did it cross the line from just being dumb to being actually a pretension to deity? We'd probably draw that line differently.
Probably, yes.
Right?
That would be the issue. Then the question arises: at what point would we man the barricades? So yeah. I don't think that Samuel is saying that. I don't think he's legislating and saying above 10%. That's against the law. I think Samuel is appealing to the people on a "don't you have eyes in your head" sort of basis.
Right.
Well, as it happens, I have eyes in my head, and I've seen what happens every time. Every time I get on this ride, I throw up. So I think that at some point, where we're trying this now for the 17th time, we're trying communism for the 17th time. At some point, prudence requires you to acknowledge that you're just being disobedient now.
Okay. Yeah. So that would be would you say that that's true? When you mentioned the
disobedient to natural law.
Right. Yeah. Well, some of it is like this, but this is, I think, part of the statesman's task is to consult both scripture to establish those basic principles. What are absolute boundaries that you can't cross? And then history and experience is the school in which you learn, oh, that was dumb. That actually, you got on the ride and then you went off the cliff. Do you think that's true of the? So I look at things like the establishment of schools in Europe, England, even in America, in a public way. They were publicly tax supported schools, and think that was a good idea. Even though here we are a couple hundred years later, lamenting that those schools founded by the stalwarts of the faith have now gone liberal, progressive, secular, and woke. But I don't attribute that mainly to there being state tax supported or state schools, as much as I do just the wider secularization, right? And so in other words, if I was in Luther's day facing what he faced, if I was in Bucer's day, Calvin's day, if I was in England in those times, and someone said, hey, we're going to establish a university, we're going to establish a system of schools, Christian schools, for the training of ministers and for the training of statesmen and all sorts of things. You have a vote, Rigney, you're going to vote for that. I think facing what they'd face, I would have voted for it. I would have said, yeah, it sounds like a great idea. You think you would, at that point, would you have said, no, you would have said, no, there's a better way, not that way. We need to do the education, but not that way.
I think that if I were back there in that situation, knowing what I know now,
yeah, that's what I mean.
I would be protesting. I'd say, look, hey, couldn't we figure out a better way to do this? But I also know that if I were back there knowing what they knew, everything they did was basically an improvement over what had gone before. Right. So basically, prudentially, one of the things that we don't recognize is how small the population was at that time.
Right.
And our population of the world now in the billions a lot of these principles, we haven't figured out how they scale yet.
Correct.
And so consequently, I understand fully why they did what they did. Mm-hmm. And I think it was foolish in retrospect. I'll put it that way. Right. Foolish in retrospect, but I don't think you'd have to be expecting them to be clairvoyant to have expected them to do anything differently.
Yeah, and I think that question of scale is actually one of the major challenges in terms of, when we think about applying these things. In order to have a Christian nation of 500 million people, say that was able to happen, it does seem that it's going to require, basically, does any institution of that scale require a much larger government or apparatus for aligning everybody, right? Like, in other words, that seems to me to be one of the biggest challenges. Is one of the criticisms that's often made from the dissident right against the system is they're like, hey, look, a system at this scale just requires a bureaucracy. It requires a managerial class. It requires propaganda, because there's no other way to get that many people to be on the same page than those mechanisms. We don't have a better mechanism than that for scaling. What do you think about that?
My tendency, I want to argue for smarter, leaner government as we scale, because I think that people want to say, if the population is big, the government has to be big. I think if the bigger the population gets, the smarter the government has to be. And just as Doge is revealing, going big just gives you all kinds of tumors to cut out. I just have a very what I like to see, for example, but I don't care about the growth of government so much as I care about the ratio between, if you looked at the federal budget and then looked at the GDP, if the GDP is growing faster than the budget is growing, if the ratio is going in the right way, I'm happy.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, Josh, you want to ask your questions, or what do you want to do?
Yeah, let's get into some questions. And it's interesting hearing you guys parse this stuff out, because in our discussion with Joe Boot, which was really great, you guys should check that out. He put in the Kuyperian sphere sovereignty model with the state, the church, and the family. He drew really sharp distinctions around those three spheres, and basically said, like, when one of the other spheres, the authority figures in the other spheres, oversteps, like that's off limits in principle, is what it seemed like Boot was saying. But what it seems like what you're saying, Pastor Wilson, and I'll let you speak to this, is that the sphere sovereignty model, thinking through the tools that God has given to the church, the state, and the family, the rod, the sword, and the keys, and so on. This is a great and helpful framework, but it's not so rigid that it is a priori off limits for one of those other authorities to in a time of crisis, or in a time, or even just prudentially, to exercise some degree of authority in the other spheres. What would you say to that, Pastor Wilson?
Yeah, I agree with that. Basically, I'm with Boot on those three governments. I'm with him that those are the spheres. Those are the governments that God created directly. And so that those spheres answer to God directly. God writes the bylaws for each of those governments. But in human society, because of the reality of sin, no government can be absolute or be treated as absolute. And that means the part of the system here is the system of checks and balances. So there were times when the church needed to be kept in line. In the medieval papacy, for example, the church got all swollen. In our day, it's the state. There have been tribal systems where patriarchal families got way too much authority. So just to illustrate, let's say you've got a family that has the children running feral upstairs. It's a true abuse situation, not a made-up abuse situation, but truly degraded, abusive, whatever. I have no problem with the neighbors intervening, the church intervening, and the state intervening. There are some parents who treat their children in such a way that the state needs to take them away, and that's not tyranny, but it's also extreme, right? And then the fact that the state is now trying to do this with conscientious, godly parents who gave their kid a swat tells you what the danger in that is. So, and as long as we recognize that there are times when the families can intervene in the state and say, the peasants with pitchforks moment, or there are times when the church steps into the family, or the families tell the elders, hey, don't do that, but it's got to be extreme. It's got to be a grease fire for that to happen.
That's helpful. This is I don't know if this is clarifying or making things more muddy for me, but I'm liking where we're going. This is good. So let's try to do some rapid fire. We've got some great questions, so we'll just try to keep these questions as concise as possible. Some for Doug, some for Pastor Rigney, some for both. But I get to ask my question first, and every time I bring this up, because I'm hosting this, so it's my show, I get to do that. Every time I bring this up on X, it becomes a huge, unbelievable controversy, and I don't see why. I say a huge, unbelievable controversy. I think really I get a lot of flack from the really crunchy Theonomists on this one, but I've said a couple of times after there's some kid gets killed by a pit bull, I say we should ban pit bulls from public life. We should do that. And natural law guys, two kingdoms guys are, yeah, hoorah, I totally agree, except for the ones that have their lovely pit bulls that they love. But in principle, they're like, yes, but then I get some crunchy Theonomist guys going, no, we cannot do that. You can't punish somebody until the crime has occurred. So you according to the theonomic principles, you can't punish, until that ox gores somebody. You can't tell them they can't have the ox, basically. So, what do you think? In principle, in your mere Christendom, could we ban pit bulls from public life because they're a danger or something like that?
Okay, so rapid fire answer. Because I'm a theonomist, I'd say no, we don't ban pit bulls, but yes, we do execute the guy whose pit bull killed a kid. And once we executed him, we wouldn't be having this debate anymore.
Okay. All right, Dr. Rigney, what do you say to that?
Yeah, so I would say that's in principle, I think you could. In other words, because even on theonomic grounds, I think you could, because if the ox is in the habit of goring, right, it treats those two scenarios differently. if it's the first time versus another. And basically, if what you've done with pit bulls is effectively bred oxes that like to gore, right? So you've selected for traits that lead to the goring. And therefore, I think you could just say no more to that breed. But I think Doug's mechanism for then, okay, so say that's the end. The end goal is we want no more pit bulls. I think prudence is what's the best way to get there. That isn't going to establish a legal principle that will come back to bite you later.
Right.
That's the joke. And I think that Doug's would be a really good one. So it's like, then that would be an actual kind of theonomic one is you're liable for your pit bull's crimes. It's not just, we execute the dog and fine you, but up the ante on the penalties of the owner. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, and I think this is actually a really good illustration of like punishments. I would put largely in the category of prudence for this reason. It's always a question of because punishments and rewards are about the means you use to accomplish the goal that you have. And parents know this as they apply it to their kids. Some kids need the spanking in order to get the message, and some kids just need a stern look, and you get the same result. And again, part of wise statesmanship is recognizing the character of the people, the history of the people, and trying to figure out what level of punishment or incentive can I put in place in order to accomplish the good end that I'm after. And so that's why, and I think theonomists sometimes agree with this when they say that the death penalty stuff is maximum penalty, not mandated in every circumstance or something like that. They allow for it. It can go up to here, but it could be, you could accomplish the same purpose of protecting life with much less stringent punishments.
Okay, so it seems like when we get down to it, the real disagreements, they are there at some level. It seems like you guys, on this particular topic, you guys would disagree in that, Joe, you would say, yes, in principle, the civil magistrate has the authority to say, whether this is prudent or not. They have responsibility to be prudent. But we're snipping all the pit bulls, and in 15 years there'll be no more pit bulls. We can just do that, whether that be prudent or not. You're saying in principle they could do that, whereas seems like Pastor Wilson, you're saying that they don't have that authority to go to invade into people's personal lives to that degree, though we might get a similar outcome by implementing the punishments that you
right. The goring ox was that ox gored before. I have trouble outlawing a goring species because then you have to kill all the alligators, and to someone who owns a golf course in Florida, is he liable for not having killed all the gators? Basically, I'd like to say if there's negligence, demonstrable negligence, just hold the owner responsible, and that disincentive is going to solve your problem.
Okay, this is good because I had one comment from Reform Zoomer, and he said, "Not gonna lie, this debate is looking like I'm classical two kingdoms versus me too, but I'm a little more libertarian." and so it's good to hear.
Because theonomy is libertarian.
Yeah, right.
Accurate.
So,
I agree.
Yeah. Because you guys agree on so much, but this topic highlighted at least some difference there in principle, I think.
Yeah.
Well, okay, I'm going to get through as many questions as I can, rapid fire style here. Let's just buckle up and knock these out of the park. All right. So this one comes also from Reform Zoomer. Do you agree that the civil magistrate was do you agree that the civil law was an application of the natural law in Israel? And that one's for Doug.
Well, I agree that the civil law is an application of the character of God, which shows up in other places, including natural law.
Okay, that's helpful. Okay, and this one is also for Doug. Is there anything less concerning about Rigney's natural law compared to Stephen Wolf's natural law? Is there a distinguishing facet that you would point to?
Yeah, I think that both Joe and Stephen Wolf would appeal to prudence, but when Stephen just recently tweeted the lawfulness of universal health care, for example, I think Stephen is applauding prudence but not exhibiting it.
All right. Okay. This one's for both. These are good. We're getting through these. This one's for both. This one comes from Tim Feeney. Why do Baptists seem to struggle with a Christian civil magistrate? Is it merely historical, or do you think there's a doctrinal reason? And we'll start with Rigney for this one.
Yeah, I think that the issue there is Baptists have always been dissenters within Christendom. And so their political theology was developed from that vantage. So I'm not, this isn't a Bulverism argument, but I think there is something to it. In other words, I think that they really do read the Bible this way. They think it requires certain things. But I think that because I think the weak spot in it is that it assumed a Christendom context and therefore finds itself adrift whenever that Christendom context evaporates. So all of a sudden, Baptists don't have a really good or consistent answer to why you can't have drag queen story hours, and or things like that. Because I think that they restrict the state so much to only second table and only certain aspects of the second table that they can't. But basically, they were relying on Christendom to do a whole bunch of cultural and political discipleship, and then they were the dissenters within that larger framework. I think the task for Baptist political theology is to try to figure out whether it's possible for them to develop something analogous to Protestant political thought, or to be simply, rather than being Baptist as a third way thing, we're not Protestants, we're not Catholics, we're Baptists, whether or not they're just a species of Protestantism that leans on the voluntary principle more heavily. And if they did that, I was trying to do that when I was still a Baptist. I called it magisterial Baptist political thought. Because it was an attempt to say, is there ways to keep the state's role in the civil magistrate in relation to vertical things, promoting the worship of God and so forth, that would still be recognizably Baptist? But I think that's the basic challenge.
Would you add anything to that, Pastor Wilson?
No, I agree with that completely.
That's great. Okay. This one comes from T. James Boone. And this one's for you, Pastor Wilson. Does theonomy have room for controlling legal immigration, including reducing it to near zero or limiting it to culturally similar nations, regardless of whether immigrants are Christian?
Yes, it does. So any civil polity has the right of self-defense, basically. And if you've got a nation that's a sugar bowl, do you have the authority to keep people from pouring white sand into it? At some point, you pour enough white sand in the sugar bowl, it's not a sugar bowl anymore. Mm-hmm. And that means the magistrates have not done their job. But at the same time, you don't want, everybody goes nuts if two immigrants come over. When Solomon built the temple, roughly 10% of Israel's population at that time was resident alien. And we know that because Solomon put them to forced labor.
Right. Okay, that's good. And this one's for both of you guys from Adam Bland. Do you consider these views mutually exclusive? Are they a priori mutually exclusive, or can they each be kind of a perspective or a starting point that ultimately brings about God's glorious ends? What do you guys think? We'll start with you, Joe Rigney.
Yeah, I think that in some way, like what Doug said at the beginning about origins and history, I think has some bearing. And so there's a question of like, I would talk in terms of God reveals himself in nature, including, so natural law is a subset of natural revelation. Doug and I think we agree on that. And scripture clarifies, applies, strengthens, grounds that same revelation. So scripture and nature speak with one voice. And so at some level, part of what happens is how important is it? Do you want to start with the natural revelation leading to special? How important, or do you want to start with special and then make sure that you say, and this isn't simply arbitrary, but it's rooted in the way that God made us? In some ways, I think that gets at the different tendencies or different starting points. And that's why I think, general equity theonomy, in my view, is basically a more biblicist form of classic two kingdoms, which is what I would call myself. So it has a biblicist flavor and accent for a variety of theological and I think historical reasons. And so I don't actually see that much difference between. This is why when we started, I said, I don't think we'll try. I'll do my best to try to poke all the spots, but I think we'll probably end up pretty similar.
Yeah, I would just add, I agree with that. And I would point out that when it comes to social organization and biblical Protestant political theory, all of us have a long way to go. Looking at the population of the world, the evangelization that has to happen, the laws that must be reformed, we've just barely gotten started. So, and to say that we're not going to learn a lot on the way is just hubris. So I regard us as we're doing political theology among the duffel puds. That's where we are right now. And we've got a long way to go. And I do believe that, as O'Connor put it, all that rises must converge.
Okay, that's great. This one's for both of you guys, and this might be a quick one, but this one's from Reformed Zoomer as well. Are socialistic policies intrinsically sinful? What if the people are pleased to have higher taxes to go towards their schools and health cares? There's some European countries that do this. So are socialistic policies intrinsically sinful? What would you say? We'll start with you, Rigney.
Yeah, depending on how defined, I think this would be lawful but stupid. And it could be lawful but extremely stupid to the point that it crosses back over into the unlawful. But it would have to get particular. And that's I probably got to run here quick. So just that may be the last one I've got. But yeah, it's lawful but really, really stupid.
And I would just say we know enough now prudentially to say that it's sin, sin, sin.
Okay, that's great. Well, we'll leave it there. What about one word of practical application? How can we put this, what we're learning about this, into practice? And you can leave it there for our viewers. And if you have to run right now, that's okay too. Pastor Wilson can leave us with a blessing. But I'll just ask that question. How can we actually put what we're learning here into practice? That was one of the last questions here.
Yeah. So I'll say I think it's important to know what you're aiming at. You're not going to hit a target you're not aiming at. So the efforts that people are making to try to understand what the basic principles are, what's lawful and unlawful, what's good and wise, all of these are worthwhile efforts and not wasted, even if you feel like, well, all you're talking about are hypotheticals that aren't happening anytime soon. But maybe your great grandkids will be able to hit that target, but you need to actually put the target on the wall. And so it's really important to get clear, lest you adopt, if you make basic errors at fundamental political principles, like if you do that, it will cascade down to all sorts of it'll come out sideways in all sorts of ways. So I think the efforts to get clear are really valuable generationally and not a waste of time, even if you think we're so far from a Christian nation at the present moment.
That's great. Thank you so much, Joe. If you got to run, that's awesome. And Pastor Wilson, if you would close us down with a word of prayer, and then we'll just...
Great. I would say read good books and get involved locally.
Okay, read good books, get involved locally. And if you could send me a little list of books that I'll put in the description, that would be great too.
Okay. All right. Father in heaven, thank you for your goodness to us. Thank you for your kindness. And we thank you for the task you've set before us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you guys so much for coming on, Pastor Wilson. Oh, and we are looking forward to hosting you. You'll be preaching here at Pilgrim Hill very soon. So we're looking forward to having you.
I will be.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you guys. Well, see you, Joe. And thank you, Pastor Wilson, for coming on. We'll have you guys on again soon, and I'll close this down here.
All right.
Well, that does it, guys. Thank you guys for tuning in. This was a really fun episode. Opened up got a little bit of clarity, and then also, opened up a lot more questions for me as well. So with that, I'll leave you guys with my charge. My hope and prayer for you guys is that all the tools that we create here would be used for you to help equip you to build, defend, and expand the kingdom of our Lord Jesus Christ.